Their names imply they're antennas. They're receivers of identity.
Now, wait a minute.
Yes.
You just said the signals are coming from the environment.
Yes.
Are you saying like the universe?
Yes. And here's the part that's what I said. You know that moment where I said in 1985 at 1:59 I was like not spiritual, and two I was spiritual because at that moment I realized that we're controlled by the environment. Each one of us is controlled as a unique individual by a separate set of signals. And what makes that important at that moment is if you kill the cells, you've never killed the source of the signal. The signal was outside. It never was on the inside.
Is it?
I mean, almost the most perfect illustration is you take some white light, you shoot it through a prism, it breaks up into the rainbow spectrum, and then I go down and divide each of the color spectrum into the smallest frequency of a unique color, and I assign that to each individual. And what it really says at some point is while we each consider ourselves as a unique entity as much as an individual color, collectively we're the white light. We have to recognize that we are all part of the same living organism called humanity, that to eliminate another person is the same as going in your own body and ripping out cells and throwing them away. And of course, the dialogue isn't right among the community, and that's why we express as a community a dis-ease. But, it's interesting because it's the same image that occurs within individuals, that if the dialogue isn't right in our own personal biological communities, then the community will fracture itself just like people do. And as a result, we express an internal disease. That we come down to this earth, that we have a unique opportunity. You said, well, what am I doing in this place? Well, here's an interesting concept if we think about it. I'm trying to say that we have this existence outside of the body, but we also have an existence in the body. So why have one or the other? What's the difference? And the answer, it really comes down to this. Without a body, if you're just a spirit, what does chocolate taste like? Or what does a sunset look like? Or what does being in love feel like? The reason why these make sense to us in our physical body is because our cells translate the environment and give us sensation that we can experience. And so, it's like come full circle and say, well, what are we doing here? My God, if there's a heaven, a place of creation, I think we're here. And the problem is, since heaven is a place of creation, you can create anything you want. And I think the biggest problem is we have leaders who are creating things that are not in our generalized picture of what we think heaven might be. And yet we can turn this all around, and this will be, I think this is the evolution that we're about to go through, and this is a very important step in human civilization because we are evolving to a higher level of awareness. And this new science, the one I told you about, that how cells control life, is part of that pivotal change. It's interesting because you say, well, you mean just a scientific belief is going to change civilization? The answer is very simple. It says, well, look, go back when we had Newtonian physics, and then all of a sudden one day we had quantum physics. As soon as we had quantum physics, our entire world changed. I mean, we don't use crank phones, we use cell phones.
That's right.
And instead of stethoscopes, we have CAT scans. And the fact is, how did that change? Because science saw how the universe was made up of something different than it thought it was. Because we're going from a point where we thought that the genes were controlling our lives to the reality that we control our genes.
Now, are there some scientists, though, who still believe in the conventional fashion?
Oh my God, most of them do.
Still,
most of because if you're not doing research at this edge, this is out in the research end. Because if you're doing teaching, you have to teach according to the textbooks, and the textbooks are right up to this minute telling you that the genes control life. Even though I can, as I told you before, you can remove the genes and life isn't affected. So this is a belief system that we're propagating, and it's totally incorrect in that regard. But the difference is, psychologically, socially, culturally, is when we own fully that the life that we're experiencing is something that we are creating. And we own that not as like, oh, isn't that a neat idea, but as a fundamental way of this is how life works. Then we have the freedom to let go of the enslavement to the power structure, to the belief that we're victims, our biology is victims to every little drug out there and every chemical and toxin, to realize, my God, you can walk on this planet as much as like walking across hot coals. If your head's right, you can walk across the hot coals.
Are you saying, though, that all drugs are not worthwhile?
Not all drugs. I would really put down there's basically very few possibly that are okay, but the biggest history in the drug research is that most of it's all placebo effect anyway. And that, yes, indeed, there's some people who actually need some drugs because I'll tell you why. They got here with birth defects. And so they got here like, it's sort of like cars come off the assembly line at the factory, and every now and then a car comes off. It's not going to work just right, and that's going to need more care and maintenance than the other ones are. But the point is 95% or more of us as a population got here with a perfectly adequate set of genes to have a prosperous, healthy, happy existence and experience on this planet.
If we took care of it.
If we understood how it worked rather than buying the stories that we were told how it worked.
So that also includes, though, what you eat, how you exercise. That's all important, too.
All of the stuff is, it's like if we collectively group it, you say, oh, this New Age phenomenon stuff, and it's sort of like, well, yeah, basically to understand that if you step aside from the concept that this is just a physical machine, I mean, we teach it in the academic sense that the body is like this vehicle. But the unfortunate part of our analogy is we never really talk about the driver. And that's the big problem of medicine. We only talk about the vehicle's well or the vehicle's defective, and we never consider, so what's the influence of the driver who's handling that vehicle, which is that spiritual stuff that was coming through those antennas that make you and I different because we're drivers, or, as most people are, unfortunately, in the world we live in, they switched on to autopilot. Imagine I take iron filings, I put them in like a salt shaker, and I sprinkle iron filings on a piece of paper.
Okay.
Every time you do that, you just get a random pile of iron filings.
Right.
But if I put a magnet underneath that paper and then sprinkle the iron filings, every time I do it, I get this pattern. And if I make a complex pattern of magnets, I get a complex pattern of iron filings. I throw away the iron filings, sprinkle it again, and guess what? It forms the same thing again. So what's the difference is iron filings are like cells, but there's a field with information, and that's like the magnet. It's an energy field.
And without that field, it's
then
nothing.
You just got a pile of random cells, and it doesn't do anything.
And
conventional biology is scientifically passé because conventional biology does not yet recognize the influence of quantum mechanics and does not express the role of energy as information in biological systems. And as a result of their completely mechanistic Newtonian perception, they look at the body as this machine, but they forget about the fields and the energy, which are actually the driver of this machine. We have an opportunity to bring life back to this place and turn it back into a garden from what almost looks like a deathbed itself. Out there, I think that we're living in a pulsing energy field involving chaos and fractal geometry. Very important part about it, and this work really leads to a scientific understanding of why nature is modeled in a fractal, and so that I'm not just saying nature is fractal because it looks like it. I'm saying it's fractal because of the design of how you expand awareness. That skin, how you make skin a two-dimensional thing into three-dimensional space requires that you use fractal geometry. And then why am I bringing that up is because, as most of the listeners might be aware, I mean, in fractals, there's self-similar images that repeat themselves at higher or lower levels of organization. And what's beautiful about this new biology is it reveals that, as I said at the beginning, every cell is like a human. It's got every ability that we have, a cell already expresses. So the image of a cell is actually reproduced in the image of a human. But then the image of a human is a cell in a larger living organism called humanity. And why this is neat is that if you really need to get to some fundamental questions, you could look at any particular level and using the fractal self-similarity, get some information about who's out there and what's going on in that sense. One of the examples was really interesting. A man who received a heart from a woman who was murdered was able to identify the murderer after he took the heart into his body.
I love stuff like that.
And then you might
just
say,
amazing.
But this is the beautiful part, because it's like, okay, now let's put the science and this paranormal together and say, so where the heck, how did that information come down there? Where'd they get that? And some people have, would say, oh, it's cellular memory. Well, look, I'm a cellular biologist, and I tell you this, cells like a liver cell, remembering it's a liver cell is a big job, The idea that it can remember chicken McNuggets and beer is not really a scenario that makes sense. But if we look at those antennas that are on the cells of the graft, they're still connected to that source. And so as long as the cells are downloading an identity, they are connected to that field of that identity. So it's interesting, these experiments, or they're not experiments, they're actually people whose lives were saved by these transplants, become